Good morning, everyone. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I'm currently heading the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Welcome to today's very timely webcast panel discussion, Whither the Middle East, More Conflict or New Peace? Today's panel is a collaborative event between the Wilson Center and the United States Institute of Peace. We're very fortunate to share distinguished fellow Robin Wright with USIP, who will be chairing today's panel discussion with our esteemed panelists, Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, Dr. Vali Nasser, and Dr. Maha Yahya. As I've noted in my introductions in previous events, Robin Wright needs no introduction in the foreign policy world, particularly when the Middle East is the topic of discussion. She's a renowned journalist and author and is leading two projects with the Wilson Center and USIP, the Islamists and the Iran Primer. So without further ado, I'll pass this on to Robin to kick us off for today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa, and welcome. We have almost 900 people who signed up for this event. It's a wonderful reflection on the admiration they have for the three speakers we have this morning. I'm really delighted at this critical juncture in the future of the Middle East to welcome our three speakers. Just a reminder, if you want to participate in the question and answer session, there are two different ways to do it. One is through Twitter, and you can send the question to the Twitter handle at Wilson Center, and they'll forward it to me. Or you can send an email to MEP@Wilson Center on email, MEP for Middle East Program. So again, it's MEP@wilsoncenter.org. Okay, so I want to get quickly to our content this morning because I'm very interested in hearing what our speakers have to say as well. So we're going to begin with Ambassador Dan Kurtzer, who has been one of America's most distinguished diplomats. He has the unusual note on his resume that he was ambassador to both Israel and Egypt. In fact, his first posting as a young political officer was in Cairo, and he was there in 1981 when Anwar Sadat was assassinated. He has served both Democratic and Republican presidents. He has also served as part of the peace process team. Today, he is a distinguished professor at Princeton. So his topic this morning is the Arab-Israeli peace process. What's next? What countries are next? What difference will the Abraham Accord make in either the peace process or perhaps changing the balance of power in the Middle East? And what about the Palestinians? Have they totally been left behind? So I'll turn it over to Dan, and he'll speak for 7 to 10 minutes, and then we'll move from there. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Robin and Marissa, and it's a pleasure to join you today. I want to start actually at 35,000 feet because the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, takes place in a region which is largely dysfunctional, as challenging as any other region that we study and operate in. It's a place where state failure, weakness of regimes, governance crises, endemic problems that seem impervious to solutions abound. Population growth leads to the possibility that young people can't get jobs, food insecurity, economic inequality and corruption. I could go on for the entire 10 minutes, but I start this way because without understanding the context in which this protracted problem remains with us, I think our discussion would be less than truthful. We do need to look at the context, and the context in the Middle East is one of very, very serious challenges in which states on the periphery of the Arab world have begun to dominate. What happens in Turkey, Iran, and Israel, as opposed to what happens in the Arab world, become much more important. And the rise of non-state actors has become far more important in many respects than the actions of state actors. Just to give you one example, since 1973, Israel has fought any number of wars with Arab actors, but not one of them has been primarily with an Arab state. Arab states have come into some of those wars, but they have been with the PLO, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. In other words, the state system in the Middle East has ceased to play a very significant role. What that has meant for the Arab actors and Israel is a very shifting and elusive balance of power. Again, important to understand this context in order to fully appreciate how challenging it is to deal with a problem like the Arab-Israeli conflict. The U.A.E. and Bahrain decisions were long in the making, as we know. They were born of frustration with Obama's perceived courtship of Iran, concerns about United States withdrawal from the region, and in the case of the U.A.E., the ability to pocket some immediate gains. First of all, suspending Israel's move toward annexing parts of the West Bank, and likely receiving soon F-35s from the United States. For Bahrain, the importance of having an American naval facility obviously was important in their agenda, as well as the pressure that Bahrain remains under from across the Gulf in Iran. And we'll hear about that when Vali offers his comments. Clearly, in the case of both Bahrain and the Emirates, there was also a payoff to President Trump, an investment in the possibility of his being reelected, but also with no serious downside should Joe Biden be elected, in that it's hard to oppose the idea of normalization between Israel and an Arab country. What a lot of this reflects is the change in the balance of power within the region. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt largely aligned against Turkey and Qatar in a number of regional conflicts. We're beginning to see a bit of competition from Egypt and Jordan that are a bit jealous of the rise of some of the Gulf states and the importance that is being attributed to Gulf state activities. In this context, the Palestinians are the outliers. They seem to be clueless. They clearly have been left out of all recent moves, not just the Bahrain and Emirates decisions, but also left out of the peace process by the Trump administration for the last 3.5 years. They have an ossified leadership. They have not had a serious election now for probably about 15 years, and they have no policy. When Palestinians are asked, why don't they come up with their own peace initiative? The answer is, how can we do so under occupation? Which suggests that there is an absence of policy planning within the Palestinian community. And unfortunately, they're not a factor in current dynamics in the Arab-Israeli or larger Middle East context. In this context, the Arab Peace Initiative is also dying a slow death. No one has formally withdrawn from it, but an initiative that was quite interesting and profound back in 2002 and reiterated several times since by Arab summits is now on the sidelines. And the only thing actually on the table is a very seriously flawed American administration initiative, which has gained no support anywhere in the world except in the state of Israel. In this context, for the Arab states that have either begun to normalize with Israel or are thinking about it, Israel is a powerful and valuable ally. It has a very strong military, has a strong economy. It's willing to act. We know that there is such a thing called the Begin Doctrine, in which Israel has acted at least twice to prevent an Arab state from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, and has said that it will act again if necessary to prevent that from happening. And for Arab states, Israel is a kind of connecting tissue to Washington. This goes back a long time. Large part of Anwar Sadat's initiative to make peace with Israel back in the 1970s was to make peace with the United States. And this idea of using Israel as a conduit to Washington remains prevalent in parts of the Arab world. What does this mean for the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli peace process? To the extent that there is any coherence in the Trump administration approach, it rests on 5 pillars. Number one, a willingness to do almost anything that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, wants. And this has been fueled by a team of ideological advisors to Trump who share many of Netanyahu's views about the Arab-Israeli peace process. Number two, the idea of cultivating Saudi and other autocratic Arabs as reliable cash customers for the United States. Number three, which Vali will talk about, pressuring Iran in the hope of regime change. Number four, promising to end military deployments, promises which have not yet been kept. And five, on the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli issue, to dismantle longstanding US policy. In other words, to break apart all of the pillars on which US policy rested until now, and to create something which they hope would be a policy for the future, but which has very little possibility of standing. Charlemagne told Pippin, his son, that it's smart to be lucky. And the administration has been smart to be lucky because, in fact, the vision that Trump put out last January had no possibility of moving forward. But in the midst of Netanyahu's consideration of annexation, the Emirati ambassador in Washington, Ambassador Oteba, put out this idea that Israel could have either normalization or annexation. And the administration was lucky enough and smart enough to grab onto that. And we now have a process based largely on normalization without a prospect of Palestinian-Israeli settlement. Will normalization replace the peace process as we know it? The answer is no. The Palestinian issue will never be resolved until there is a territorial component. Palestinians require self-determination in a state of their own, living side by side with Israel in peace and security. Many have tried to develop options other than a two-state solution. We tried to do so, in fact, in a graduate seminar at Princeton, and others have tried the same, and there frankly is no alternative to a two-state solution. It's going to be hard to do, harder every day with settlement activity, but that's the only option out there for resolving the conflict. And that means we may need to await a different leadership in the region, and we need to revive some basic fundamentals of American policy. 3 things to think about moving ahead, and with this I would conclude. Number one, if the United States wants to be serious about helping the parties reach a settlement, it'll have to do what it has not done for the last 25 years, and that is address the asymmetry in power between Israel and the Palestinians. That means leaning towards Israel on security and leaning towards the Palestinians on territory and governance. Number two, the United States would have to get serious with both sides about accountability and consequences for actions that contradict the peace process. We have a long history of holding the Palestinians accountable. We do not have a similar history of holding Israel accountable for such things such as settlements. And third, we need to think about refocusing our relationship with Israel to put it on a sounder footing. Right now, Israel remains a recipient of security assistance. Recently, I wrote an article together with Yossi Beilin, a former Minister of Justice and Deputy Foreign Minister in Israel, in which we suggested that Israel can be a cash customer for the United States. This would mean that Israel would have to make tough decisions with regard to where it invests its money. But the United States can also help assure Israel's security by building in agreements on access to defense technology and to R&D. In other words, to set our policy straight, not only on the peace process, with a more balanced and fair policy toward both Israel and the Palestinians, but also putting our relationship with Israel on a sounder and much more mature footing. And with that, Robin, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dan. As usual, you are incredibly thoughtful, but I have one quick question. You didn't answer my question about what countries are next. By my count, with 22 members of the Arab League as formal states, there are 4 countries that have peace deals with Israel. That leaves 18. There are a lot of rumors about the possibility of Sudan being the next. Who do you think? Are there some obvious ones, and do they mean anything? Just very briefly.
Well, there are no obvious choices. Sudan probably has the most money being wagered on it. And I think it's indicative of the problem when a country that has been a state supporter of terrorism is now being wooed as a potential partner for Israel. So Sudan may be next simply because they have a significant amount to gain. The U.A.E may pay some of its bills, and the United States takes it off the terrorism list. There's some rumors that Chad, of all countries, will be soon thereafter. I doubt that we're going to see an early decision by any of the other Gulf countries. And we've heard from North African countries, including Morocco, that they're unlikely to move without progress on the Palestinian issue.
That's fascinating. I had not thought about Chad. Okay,
Yeah, I have my money on Chad, actually.
Ah, how much? Okay, now we move to Vali Nasser. Vali is one of the world's leading experts on Iran and the Gulf. He was actually born in Iran, and I believe his family fled either shortly before or after the 1979 revolution. Many of you have read Vali's best-selling books. He is the former dean at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he is still a professor. Vali has also had a role in consulting with both Democratic and Republican administrations. He served as special advisor or senior advisor to U.S. Special Representative Richard Holbrooke during the talks on Afghanistan. So Vali is going to explore both the internal challenges in Iran amidst collapsing oil prices, a sporadic series of protest movements, a COVID pandemic that has gotten worse. After all, Iran was one of the early epicenters. And he's also going to explore all the big questions of Iran's tensions with the outside world, given the United States maximum pressure campaign that involved a whole new set of sanctions just this week on Ministry of Defense outlets, and the threat to also sanction any company or any country around the world that sells either conventional or unconventional arms to Iran. Now, one note to frame Vali's comments is that the top Pentagon officials I've met with recently say that the one conflict they are most worried about anywhere in the world over the next 6 months is with Iran. And this is very real. We'll get back to the question of October surprise and what Dan wrote recently, but let me begin that with that kind of broad set of issues for Vali. Over to you, Vali.
Thank you, Robin, and thanks for inviting me to this forum. And it's great to be with Dan and Maha on this panel. So I want to dovetail on what Dan said. First, starting from I think the broader picture, and then going into the domestic scene in Iran. The Trump administration has followed a very interesting an experiment of first of all, coming out and essentially claiming to the region and the world that it's going to solve the biggest problems in the region once and for all. The Arab-Israeli issue, which obviously it abandoned, but also it's going to fix the problem of Iran. And it wanted to also do that simultaneously as it signaled to the region that it's beginning to leave from the region. President Trump made it very clear that he really didn't want to have much to do with military presence in the region. We're seeing the United States is leaving Afghanistan, talking to a mortal enemy, the Taliban reaching an agreement to leave. We're seeing American footprint shrink in Iraq, in Syria, even around the Gulf. And in some ways, this Israel U.A.E deal, the incentive in Washington was for Israel to backfill to some extent for the U.S. departure. And that has been actually a destabilizing process for the region. I mean, the idea of the United States leaving, if nothing else had changed, would already change too many things on the chessboard and would have been destabilizing to the region. But at the same time, the United States escalating the way it's doing with Iran is actually adding further fuel to the fire. So we're at a moment where we're seeing the region become much more unstable, conflictual. As you said, there's potential for an outright conflict with Iran. And yet the trend is towards a less of a US presence in the region. I think regardless of what Washington says, in the region, everybody understands that we don't have the stamina to stay. It's not a matter of just public opinion in the US. The fight that the president is picking up with China, which is likely to continue, is going to demand a lot of American military, diplomatic, economic resources that cannot be dedicated to the Persian Gulf region or the Middle East. The American economy is not in a good place to keep pouring trillions of dollars into another major war in the region. So in a sense, although President Trump has delivered to Persian Gulf countries and other Arabs and Israel the idea that he's going to walk away from the nuclear deal, he's going to put Iranians under pressure, and they may be cheering for that. But his view, his notion that America is going to stand behind its policy is not credible to the region. And it's not credible to the Iranians either. And that's a problem why this policy is not effective, because nobody really believes that it's actually a long-run policy, that the United States is going to run out of breath pretty soon. And in some ways, it has with Iran. So, the Iran is being put under maximal amount of economic pressure. It cannot sell any oil. Its economy is in tatters. The secondary sanctions against other countries doing business with Iran has really bitten hard. And the US keeps ratcheting it up, but it has not got a new negotiations with Iran on the nuclear deal. And also it has not brought the regime down. The only thing it has essentially done, it's hardened at least the top of the Iranian regime behind a sort of a resistance policy. And the administration is hoping that the population will not buy into this and they will not allow the political elite in Iran to follow this strategy. But for now, it hasn't worked. So yes, Iran has gone through a lot of unrest. The unemployment is high. The inflation is high. The country's currency has collapsed. It has reached sort of record lows vis-a-vis the dollar. The Iranian middle class cannot trade, cannot do business, cannot travel. The COVID pandemic is spreading in Iran. The Iranian foreign minister was saying on Monday at a session at Council on Foreign Relations that Iran cannot actually import flu vaccines into Iran because it cannot do the financial transaction for vaccinating the population against flu. The Iranian public is definitely happy, is definitely dejected, but there is no mass revolution in Iran. And in fact, if it was, it's not a recipe for stability in the region. If a country of 80 million collapsed, it's not going to end up being a democracy overnight, the way the Bush administration imagined Iraq when Saddam goes. It's likely to be an Iraq to the power of 10. And that's not even a good recipe when the United States is on its way out of the door. So, we're in a very bad spot in the region. And the idea that I think the administration had of somehow getting the Israelis to step up to support strategically U.A.E., Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain as the U.S. is withdrawing is perhaps attractive to U.A.E. And Bahrain and perhaps Saudi Arabia, that this military intelligence relationship that they've had with Israel now can be formalized, and Israel's strategic asset could be brought into the Persian Gulf in order to backfill for what the US is not going to be doing. But I'm not sure that's a good thing for Israel. I mean, in the longer run, it will get it into a whole new arena of conflict with Iran. And it's also going to be destabilizing. I mean, we really have to test the proposition of what happens if the Iron Dome is put around Abu Dhabi by Israelis, or if Israelis begin to provide security for U.A.E. And the idea of giving F-35s to countries around the Gulf is just going to fuel an arms race. I mean, on the one hand, we're saying we want the Iranians to negotiate to reduce their proxy footprint in the region and to reduce their missile ranges and numbers. On the other hand, we're arming their rivals right 90 kilometers south of their border with very sophisticated weaponry, which is only going to give incentive to the security forces in Iran to double down on their investments in conventional military countermeasures. And so, there's a sense that the US wants to leave this region to its own fate. It wants to say, we did everything possible to weaken Iran, but we're not here for the long run. And even if we said we're here for the long run, I think that the proposition is not very credible going forward. Now, the two things I would say, one is that, yes, domestically, I think Iran is much more fragile, but I would not read too much into sort of the claims that it's about to fall. Iranians, by virtue of the experience of the past 40 years, have learned how to suffer. Now, we don't know where the break point is, but in Iraq, we found that there wasn't a break point until literally US troops arrived in Baghdad. So I wouldn't necessarily think that we're going to see 1979 repeated. That's sort of reading back into history, a very different regime, a very different population, a very different circumstance. And in fact, as much as the population is suffering, there is, in some levels, a nationalistic sense there. So we are seeing contradictory pictures in Iran. There are riots in the streets. There is a lot of unhappiness. There's a lot of criticism of President Rouhani and the government. But when Soleimani was assassinated, the outpouring of public sentiment in Iran was unprecedented. It was far larger than the funeral for Khomeini. Now, you have to read what that means, who came out, that Iranians are not sort of one-dimensional people, and U.S. pressure is bringing out very different contradictory dimensions in them. But one thing President Trump has succeeded, he has succeeded in a regime change of sorts in Iran. He has weakened the moderates and the reformists considerably. He has clearly weakened anybody in Iran who argued that Iran should gradually open to the West and look not just to a nuclear deal, but look to business, trade, and eventual normalization. And far more hardline views on resistance to the United States have taken over in a condition where, Iran, and I have to say that the Revolutionary Guards, Iranian intelligence people believe that a lot of the demonstrations are orchestrated by outside agents, that the maximum pressure was a two-punch strategy, that you squeeze Iranian public until they get unhappy, and then you set the fuse by actually having agents on the ground that would provoke things and put things on social media, et cetera. It's not true necessarily, but it's what they believe. And in that kind of an environment, they're much more harsh on dissent than would be expected. And in that kind of an environment, more and more powers are moving away even from the civilian side of the Iranian government to the Revolutionary Guards. And when and if the United States sit at the table with Iran, they're going to find out that they're dealing with much more hardline and tougher negotiators than the ones that they dealt with in 2013. Now, the big question is whether there would be talks between US and Iran. President Trump is advertising that he'll have a deal with Iran 2 weeks after he's in office, although his definition of a deal could be quite elastic. I mean, anything from agreeing to agree to talks could be construed by him as a deal to an actual deal. And then there's a question about what happens if there's a Biden administration and whether you can end up having a conversation again. And the Democratic Party platform says that the US is willing to go back to JCPOA, to the nuclear deal. But I think going forward with Iran is going to be very difficult, largely because the US has shown that it can leave the deal at any moment it wants and reimpose sanctions. So I don't think the Iranians will come back to the table easily and come back into full compliance. And then, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 2 years from now, the United States again withdraws from the deal and reimposes the sanctions. And negotiating those kind of guarantees with Iranians is going to be extremely tough, largely because of even the way the sanctions regimes in the US works, the role of the Congress, et cetera. And then trying to go beyond what already the JCPOA agreed to is going to be a very tough road ahead. And in fact, the more the US talks to Iran, and in fact, if the Biden administration is successful in dealing with Iran, that will bring back Israel and U.A.E. and Saudi Arabia to the same angst they had about the Obama administration. I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't talk to Iran and have a good deal and not have the United States move a little closer to Iran and reduce tensions with Iran. So that's where the whole thing is stuck. I mean, I see the possibility of talks, largely because Iran is incentivized to revive JCPOA, has never left it. But I don't see that the region is going to be moving back to where it was in 2015. I think we're in a far worse spot with far less American ability to now shape the events on the region.
Thank you, Vali, very much. I appreciate that. When we get back to the questions, I also want you to address the year looking ahead in Iran, because there are some catalysts for change with a presidential election coming up in May. And as you said, the reformers have been not only weakened, but almost marginalized, that they're not even much of part of the debate today. So I want to kind of look at the domestic side, and also how the Iranians themselves evaluate the pandemic and the way it's been handled, but we'll get back to that. I want to make one correction, reminder for those who do want to ask questions. You can do it one of two different ways. One is to tweet at Wilson Center MEP for Middle East Program. Again, that's at Wilson Center MEP, or to send an email to mep@wilsoncenter.org. We all look forward to your questions. Now, I want to turn to Maha, one of my very, very favorite people in the Middle East. She and I have wonderful conversations every chance I get to get back to Beirut. She is in Beirut, where she is the director of the Carnegie Endowment's Middle East program, from where she joins us today, and where she was present during the very traumatic explosion that ripped across Beirut. Maha formerly worked for the United Nations, where she did seminal work on issues for the Arab Development Report, one of the first times that the region was evaluated with kind of a neutral global perspective. And it's been incredibly important in defining the issues, the demographics, the changes across the region. She's going to tackle two of the biggest existential challenges in the Middle East. One is Lebanon as a microcosm of the challenges that are faced by so many Arab states. It faces economic demise. Its monetary system is on the verge of collapse. Its political system, controlled by warlords ever since the end of the 15-year civil war in 1990, is dysfunctional, to put it mildly. And of course, you have a powerful militia that has emerged as one of the most, not only powerful militias anywhere in the Middle East, but a powerful political player too. Having spent 5 years of my life in Lebanon during the Civil War, the Israeli invasion, I thought little Lebanon couldn't face anything worse. And what is really striking is it faces even deeper existential challenges today. She's also going to look at the Syrian civil war as we approach the 10-year anniversary of its protests, the Arab uprising that then led to one of the grisliest wars in Middle East history. So I want to turn it over to Maha. Enlighten us on both of these challenges, and what is the reality, and is there any prospect of hope on either count?
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Wilson Center, for inviting me to be part of this panel and to be with Dan and Vali in this interesting discussion. I like the word existential crises. I think everywhere you turn in this region, there's an existential crisis somewhere. I want to pick up from where Vali left in one of his last comments, which is, yes, this is a region that is facing a far larger existential crisis as a region as a whole. It's in a much worse condition than it was in 2015. However, barring the JCPOA and the potential, I mean, we have to wait and see what the election results will be. I think there are places where some negotiations can happen. Lebanon and Syria with Iran. Lebanon and Syria are two potential openings that are below the nuclear policy, but that are just as fundamental for the stability of this region. And in fact, the fact that Iran's malign activity across the region was not addressed as part of the JCPOA was one of the reasons why there was so much of a resistance to the JCPOA in the region itself here. Some people saw it, oops, sorry. That wasn't an explosion. Some people saw it positively, but many people across the region were very wary of the JCPOA at the time because it did not engage with Iran's activities in Syria and Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq and elsewhere. To just look very quickly at the region from also 35,000 feet, and then I will come to Lebanon and Syria. This is a region that is in the Pax, post-Pax Americana setup. We're looking at a region where pragmatism, if you want, in foreign policy reigns supreme. There's a sort of Qatarization of foreign policy. Every country is doing what it thinks is best for it. And the foreign policy changes from one place to the other. So while the U.A.E. may stand with the Syrian regime or has created an opening with the Syrian regime and has opened, has now reopened its embassy, its positioning in Lebanon is quite different, and so on. Same for Turkey and others. So you'll see the same players in different parts of the region having a very different policy tools that they're using, but also different partnerships that they're pushing forward depending on the place they're in. Zooming into Lebanon, as Robin outlined, the place is in a catastrophic situation, and the worst is yet to come, unfortunately. In the fact that I can say this after an explosion that literally blew up, damaged half the city, led to the displacement of 300,000 people who lost their homes or had their homes damaged. They had to leave their homes. More than 6,500 people injured, more than 200 killed, and fast forward 40 days later, we still don't know what happened. There's no credible narrative out there that tells us what happened. The Beirut explosion is in some ways Lebanon's own Chernobyl. It epitomizes the gross mismanagement and the corruption, the rot that lies at the heart of the governance system in this country, where, I mean, not to go into too many details, but where you have a sectarian power sharing overlapping with a network of clientelistic, nepotistic, relationships that have transformed state institutions into extensions of political / sectarian fiefdoms. This is, turn anywhere in the region, you'll find something similar, but on a different, with a different flavor, if you like. The place where Lebanon is today is that 4 out of its 5 key pillars are literally collapsing. The political system is very much in crisis. All political leaders have lost their legitimacy. We're now looking at a government formation that has been bottlenecked, despite the crisis, despite the fact that the country is literally collapsing economically. It's now in a hyperinflation mode. The currency has lost 70 to 80% of its value. More than 50% of the population is below the poverty line now. We're worried about famine, massive unemployment, businesses closing, and yet government formation has been stuck for the past 3 weeks. A French initiative put forward, kind of pushed the machine rolling a little bit forward, but then it got stuck. And it's gotten stuck because the vested interests in Lebanon are not about local vested interests, but also directly connected to what Iran wants, what the French want, what the Turks want. I mean, for the French coming into Lebanon, it's partly because they don't want to see Lebanon collapse. This is their young creation. Lebanon turns 100 in September, turned 100 in September, on September 1st. But also obviously to counter a growing Turkish influence that we're seeing. Turkey has historically, or at least over the past decade, has been building up connections underneath. I mean, it's been displaying some sort of soft power. It's been building up connections with the Sunni community in Lebanon through cultural centers, citizenship. It's given citizenship to a lot of Lebanese. I think something like 17,000 Lebanese have now have dual citizenship. It has a lot of the sheikhs here, the Sunni sheikhs, have connections to Istanbul in one way or the other. Many of them have small apartments there. So it's slowly been building up its leverage and its influence within that community. But it really has remained at the level of a more soft cultural, some financial support, etc. What we're looking at today is with the collapse, with the collapse of the system. I think one of my neighbors decided to fix something in their house today. My apologies. With the collapse of the system today, we're looking at the collapse, the economic collapse. This is creating a situation that is very open and very loose, and that will allow a lot of new actors to enter into the scene and kind of display different kinds of influence. Turkey is one of them. The Emirates is that until now has not really been very active. We're beginning to see it kind of prepare itself for more action in Lebanon, for more involvement in the local in the local political scene. The question today is, what next? Where do we go from here? When it comes to Lebanon, quite frankly, if a government is not formed in the next, coming weeks, the situation is beyond catastrophic. It's already pretty bad right now. They're going to be removing fuel subsidies, and there's no confidence. People are leaving by the hundreds, if not thousands. Whoever can leave is leaving. The French, what looks like a French Hariri initiative happened yesterday. They've basically opened the door to one of the bottlenecks. I'm not going to get into the detail because it becomes really kind of looking at the weeds. I can answer any questions. They put forward an initiative that could potentially resolve the bottleneck around government formation. Everyone is now waiting for the response from Hezbollah and Amal, who were the ones that had kind of thrown a wrench into the government formation. This will tell us the extent to which Iran is interested in stabilizing the situation in Lebanon. My own reading is they are. The last thing they need is a situation where the country collapses completely. This is, after all, the backyard of Hezbollah. The jewel and the crown of Iranian activity outside of Iran. If that does not happen, the situation is going to get a lot more dire, and I think we could potentially see emerging conflicts down the road as the country opens up to more and more influence. Already we're seeing a lot more security incidents across the country. Yesterday there was a massive explosion in South Lebanon in an arms depot. We believe it's an arms depot belonging to Hezbollah. There was also an outbreak of shooting north of Beirut. We still don't know the details of this. And then there were a couple of other fires that are now in Valley. It's the same scenario we're seeing in Iran, where explosions are happening quite more frequently. Fires are erupting more frequently. Yesterday, another fire erupted in a paint factory in South Beirut. So things are disintegrating on the ground and will get much worse if there isn't a government formation that would then unlock some humanitarian support, would unlock a deal with the IMF that would allow at least some fiscal and economic support for Lebanon. For Syria, we're looking at a similar, I think, frankly, a continued status quo until the American elections. Because whoever ends up in the presidential, as the president, the new president of the US, will determine to a great degree what happens in both Lebanon and Syria, partly as a result of the US-Iran tensions, but also what kind of political settlement is going to be put forward on the table for Syria, which also will have a detrimental effect for a positive or negative, actually, effect for Lebanon. In Syria today, what we're looking at is the existing parties, Turkey, Russia, Iran. Everybody is kind of hunkering down, trying to maximize their gains on the ground and kind of create a firewall around the territory that they are controlling. It's a situation that is quasi in limbo until the American elections and until we see what is going to happen in that place. Sorry.
Thank you, Maha. I have to say that the idea that somebody's fixing something in Lebanon is a hopeful sign. So
yeah, no, I think people are still fixing their homes, and it's astonishing. It's been a month, nobody's done a single thing, and now all of a sudden I hear them doing this. Let me just add on three recommendations of what can be kind of done. I think the US, in the short term, the maximum pressure policy that they are using with Iran and with Hezbollah is going to break Lebanon. The idea that breaking Lebanon to rebuild it, this kind of mantra, is completely false. Breaking Lebanon means that local militias, they're the ones who actually are able to navigate in a chaos, including Hezbollah, and they will be the last people standing, if you like. So there needs to be some work with the French to stabilize Lebanon in the short term. Especially this is a country that has 1 million refugees. This is obviously in addition to the recommendations made by Dan. Another area would be an alignment of positions on Syria between the US and other Gulf countries to make sure that once there is a serious discussion, I suspect after the American elections, there is a serious discussion of what political settlement could actually end the conflict. I don't see Syria being reunited anytime soon, but at least some sort of a stabilization of the situation there. Finally, just in terms of Lebanon, I have to make this appeal. This is a country that is in desperate need for support, financial support. So perhaps a humanitarian fund that is led by the US and that allows at least people not to die of starvation in this country, and that allows some rebuilding activities to take place. Until now, the only rebuilding that's happening is happening through the private sector. And this is my last comment. What was remarkable after the explosion is the complete absence of the state and the total presence of people, Lebanese helping each other, whether abroad or in the country. Thank you.
thank you, Maha. And we'll get back to the issue of new actors and some of the younger generation. We've seen this over and over and over again. And one of the things I have yet to be convinced is that that energy, that youth, that dynamism, like we saw in the Arab Spring, will actually lead to something tangible. But I want to go back to Dan, and there have been allusions already to the question, but you wrote a very interesting piece last week about the potential October surprise during the US election. And your direct quote was, "The most likely scenario involves an escalation with Iran, a country that has been at the top of the Trump enemy list since assuming office." You know, we talk about that almost as if we're throwing it out kind of glibly, but clearly any kind of conflict between a major power and Iran, which has the largest military in the Middle East, would be very different because of the asymmetry. We have all the air power in the world, but Iran has extraordinary depth when it comes to allies, proxies, and the kind of mess that they could create, diverting our attention from a military victory. You know, it's not going to be Iraq again. And so I'm interested in how you see this conflict. What could be the trigger? How does this play out? And the whole issue of asymmetry. I did talk to a senior Pentagon official who said, we know that if we retaliated, whether it's for the assassination of an ambassador or that there was some act that even the death of American troops in Iraq, that we could hit hard. We know the Iranians would strike back at us. The question is, what do we have the tools? Do we have the game plan to counter Iran at its own game? Because Iran may redefine the nature of any kind of conflict. Over to you, Dan.
Sure. When Steve Simon and I were talking about this article, all of the factors that you just mentioned came into play, including the fact that Trump has proved to be very risk averse throughout his presidency. And he's got to know, and his advisors would have to tell him, that any escalation with Iran would not be a simple one-off where you shoot a few missiles or you drop a few bombs and then go home and wait for a single response. On the other hand, there are at least three factors to bear in mind. Number one, not only has Trump defined Iran alongside China as the two biggest threats to international security and to American security, but he has now, in a sense, cleansed his administration of anyone who will argue against him. He has an administration that is now pretty solidly anti-Iran, to the point where one can imagine there is consideration of military options. Number two, there are clearly other issues that are going to define the American election. Biden is trying to make COVID the issue. We now have the question of the Supreme Court, the economy. But the question is how desperate this president can become in mid-October if the polls continue to show how poorly he is doing in particularly the swing states. Number three, third factor is the Israel factor. Today, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz, is in Washington with apparently a shopping list that includes, according to the Israeli press, some very high-powered weaponry, including tankers for long-range refueling. We know that Netanyahu, at least 3 times in the past, has tried to persuade his national security team to attack Iran. Nobody wants to start a war, but Israel may believe that Iran, after the JCPOA has essentially been stalled, that Iran has reached a point in its enrichment capability that it is closer to a breakout. And therefore, this Begin doctrine that I referred to earlier may kick in. So there may be a push from the Israelis, who now have allies in the Gulf, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. They have overflight rights over Saudi Arabia, solving some of their own military problems, and therefore may be much more inclined to push a Trump administration at a moment when the electoral prospects look dim. Would I give this high odds? The answer is no, largely because of the risk-averse nature of this president, but I don't rule it out. And even if it doesn't take place in October, we may republish the article in December should Trump lose, and call it the December surprise, a going away present to the region.
That's fascinating. That's something I hadn't thought about. But one question, in terms of creating a coalition of the willing, like we did with Iraq, when most of the world would oppose, I think, a war between the United States and Iran, is it enough to have Israel, U.A.E., Bahrain as partners in a coalition? And again, I go back to this asymmetric issue. This is where Hezbollah is estimated to have 130 to 150,000 missiles that it could strike Israel, that it has proxies, a PMF, dozens of branches of the popular mobilization forces in Iraq that could strike not only US interests, but perhaps even members of the Iraqi government who are pro-American. That this is, I get back to this assumption that because our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were kind of down and dirty, we did it in a matter of weeks in ousting what were deemed to be powerful or well-armed entities, whether it's in October or December. And related to that is this whole question, when you talk about the Trump administration, I've had the impression that President Trump and his Secretary of State may not always see eye to eye. Pompeo has talked quite openly as a member of Congress about regime change. We know when he was at the CIA that he wanted them to look for kind of nefarious activities by Iran. Whereas Trump has repeatedly said he wants to engage. And there was a close call at the United Nations last year where the French got very close to setting up a meeting. And in the end, because Trump was not willing to deal with the issue of lifting sanctions, Rouhani locked himself in his bedroom. So if you could address those two aspects.
Look, I think on the second issue, I think the prospect of diplomatic engagement goes up exponentially if Trump wins re-election. I think he will be desperate to meet with the Ayatollah or with the president of Iran in the same way he was desperate to meet with the leader of North Korea, believing that if only he could sit across the table, make a good friendship, he could cut a deal. I think he's wrong on that, but I think he will be desperate to do so in a second term. I don't see this happening as even a remote possibility between now and November 3rd. It would be so abhorrent to his quote unquote base, including his national security team, that even this very unpredictable president, I think, would be unlikely to do so. With regard to a larger coalition, several years ago, I wrote two pieces actually for the Council on Foreign Relations on the prospect of renewed conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. And I made a statement in one of those reports that Israel might not be able to fight two wars or on two fronts if it opened up a front with Hezbollah and there was a front with Iran. And I happened to be in Israel shortly afterwards, and a very senior military official with whom I met said to me, well, you don't understand our military. We can fight two wars simultaneously. Now, setting aside hubris, both on the part of the Israeli military and on the part of the American military, I don't think the prospect of Hezbollah's firing rockets at Israel would deter Netanyahu from taking action against Iran if the Israeli intelligence community makes a persuasive case that the breakout time for a serious run towards a nuclear weapon has gotten too short. You remember going into the JCPOA in 2015, we were at a period of a matter of months before this breakout period would take place. And then the JCPOA lengthened that to probably about a year. We may be back now to a much shorter period, given the fact that Iran has upped its enrichment since the United States pulled out of the JCPOA in 2018. So I don't think it frankly matters to the United States and Israel whether or not there's a larger coalition. Again, I think the chances of an October surprise are remote, but I don't think it's off the table because of the possibility of a tough war should war ensue.
Thanks, Dan. Let me just put in a plug for the Iran Primer, which is the world's largest database on Iran. And it's co-sponsored by the Wilson Center and the U.S. Institute of Peace. It is literally the world's largest database. And we have run many, many articles looking at the question of the 5 breaches by Iran, how that changes the calculation on its weapons programs. So there are resources if people have questions to look at the Iran Primer just Google it on the web. So that makes a natural transition to volley. And as I mentioned earlier, Iran is in this incredible moment of transition politically with the parliamentary elections were earlier this year and the hardliners won an overwhelming majority. They had the runoff election this month delayed by COVID, which only made their numbers ever larger. The president is up for re-election. Iran, like the United States, has a 2-term limit. And so there will be a whole new cast of characters for Iranians to choose from. And the question is, if the Trump administration is so anxious for a deal, or President Biden, if he is elected, would want to go back to some form of diplomacy and possible some variation of the original nuclear deal. Does the current administration in Iran, President Rouhani, Foreign Minister Zarif, who did most of the negotiation, can they pull it off? Could they convince the hardliners, the Iranian public to re-engage with the United States? And also, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the election and who are the emerging names. We're clearly a long way, but there's a lot of speculation about some obvious candidates and what their attitude might be on the issue of diplomacy with the United States.
So let me actually first take up a few points where Dan left it off, because I think this idea of an October surprise bears on everything that you said. Although, this election, so many people are voting early that an October surprise will potentially be impacting a smaller and smaller number of Americans as they vote. But it's a real thing. And I think the Iranians are taking it very seriously. And I think some of the way they may be reading it is along the lines that you and Dan said, namely that it's not so much maybe about the outcome of the American election as it is about how Bibi Netanyahu or Secretary Pompeo look at post-November. So there's a sense that if they think that both a new Trump administration and a new Biden administration may be willing to talk to Iran, then you want to do things to basically make that impossible. And we've reached the point that some kind of a hot conflict is likely the best case there. Trump may very well decide he wants to really get the Nobel Prize, and he wants to sit down and talk with the Ayatollah or the president, as Dan said. And the Biden administration may basically at least lower the temperature with Iran and go back into the nuclear deal. So that gives you have a tail wagging the dog scenario here, and I think that Secretary Pompeo's now argument that U.S. ships may actually stop Iranian ships on high seas and board them is literally a step towards an act of war. And I would say, first of all, the Iranian reaction is unpredictable. I think one of the reasons the Iranians carried the attack on Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia was actually a deterrence. It was to showcase to the US and Israel and others that they now have unpredictable weaponry. That the fact that they did what they did was an extremely precise attack going around American radar systems, Saudi radar systems, was designed basically to say that don't think that this is 1987 or this is the way you see us. You're looking in the back, in the rear mirror, you think we're going to react this way, we're going to react in Lebanon in this manner, we're going to react with rockets. But we could actually conduct this war very, very differently. And then, this alliance now with U.A.E. and Israel comes into this. The first statement the Iranian Revolutionary Guards gave after U.A.E. and Israel announced this was that Iran will now hold U.A.E. responsible for any act that Israel carries out inside Iran. I mean, that's obviously very sort of a broad statement, but the signal is, okay, you signed this, but now you're also a target in any kind of a retaliation against Israel. So now the question is, does this alliance actually serve as a brake on Netanyahu or on Israel? Or is it actually complicate things so that actually gives Iran additional targets to hit? And hitting U.A.E. or Bahrain is now much easier than in fact maybe for Hezbollah being unleashed on Israel. And that's exactly why, as I said, we're in a much more complicated, difficult place. Now, a war, an aggression against Iran, my sense is that it actually will serve the hardliners in Iran. I don't see a scenario in which the Iranians would side with the United States and especially side with Israel in a war, and that there won't be a rally to the flag moment in Iran. And that actually changes all the calculation about presidential elections. It changes the calculation about talking already the idea of talking to the United States is a very difficult proposition in the American political system. Iranian parliament now has its version of Tea Party or QAnon, if you want to go that farther, that basically will are having their day, and therefore that will have an impact. If there is no military confrontation, if the door to some kind of de-escalation is there, my assumption is that we will end up with a moderate conservative Iranian president, not the most hardline figures that are there, like Saeed Jalili, who was national security advisor and at one time negotiator, not Ahmadinejad, who's also throwing his hat in the ring, thinking that the economic pressure that US has brought on Iran has provided them with a second lease on life with populism, and not moderates, outright moderates or reformists, although Iran's foreign minister remains extremely popular in Iran. And people talk about him being a potential candidate quite openly. He said he's not running, but that's sort of dangling out there. But there is a middle that, the current speaker of the parliament was a former Revolutionary Guard commander and was mayor of Tehran, Ghalibaf, the former speaker of the Majlis, Ali Larijani. People of this type are seen to be very viable candidates. They are not averse to engaging the West, but they are much more hardline on these sets of issues than the moderates would be. And then there's also a number of technocrats who are pushing very hard to say that Iran's problems now need not a political solution, not moderate, reformist, or hardline, but it actually needs professionals. Like this, a lot of people talk about the head of Iran's central bank as a potential candidate. It's sort of apolitical technocrat who could take command of the economy and would actually be able to do what the supreme leader says, fix the economy in a way that you won't be susceptible to the US. That is almost opening the door for a very different kind of an Iranian president. But the mood of we're not going to have the formal application for who's running until March. So the mood of the country, the mood of the electorate, where is Iran with the United States would be quite key. Now, getting back with the US and Iran has a lot of process. There's a lot of pre-talking that has to happen. That could, in fact, start right after the American election. It could start under Rouhani. And US is not going to get the deal with Rouhani, nor does it want to deal with Rouhani, but maybe it wants to create the momentum in that direction. So even when Iranians are going to decide who they're going to vote for, that momentum might be impactful in the election. And then you have a new administration coming in, and it's not put in a position of having to start from scratch with the United States, but actually can claim that it's picking up on whatever positive momentum has been created. And an October surprise is designed to make this not possible. I think it has more about what it could do in potential of US-Iran relations than necessarily in the American elections.
Thanks very much. I want a 30-second answer because we need to go on to Maha. And that is, the Supreme Leader talked about this just this week, again, about revenge for the death or assassination of General Soleimani. It reminds me a little bit of Hezbollah promising retaliation for the death of Imad Mughniyeh, who was head of its military wing 11 years ago, and nothing happened that we can see as cause and effect. Is this hot air? Is this something you anticipate? Could be a trigger? Again, 30 seconds.
So partly it's constituent management, both in Iran and in the Arab world, to say that they haven't forgotten. And partly they are also reading the hot rhetoric about October surprise here. And it's a deterrence to say that we're ready and we'll react.
Great. So let's move, before I move on to Maha, I just want to remind people if they have questions, because we're running out of time, tweet at Wilson Center MEP for Middle East Program, at Wilson Center MEP, or email mep@wilsoncenter.org. Okay, Maha, back to this big question of, okay, you've got two disintegrating societies, and yet there have been imaginative protests by the young, particularly, all generations, but particularly the young. The last time around, it was, imaginative in the Arab world, bringing down 4 governments where the heads of state had ruled for a total of more than 130 years. And yet it didn't lead to the kind of tangible system or change that created good systems. In some cases, we actually, as in Egypt, saw a more autocratic leadership under former Field Marshal el-Sisi. So do the new actors, the younger generation in Lebanon, do they have a means, are they channeling their protests into new political parties or entities that could affect elections if if Lebanon holds them? Is there a younger generation in Syria that will hold Assad to account in the aftermath of a war that's killed at least 500,000 of its citizens?
I think that was a Freudian slip, Iran, Robin, given Iran's influence in both countries. Just very quickly, I think these are 2 different contexts. The civil society actors, the younger generation and the older generation, are operating in 2 very different theaters. In Lebanon, most of them are in Lebanon, but also coordinating with a large diaspora outside that's trying to provide whatever support it can in different ways. There's a lot of action since October 2019, when the protests erupted. There are, I know of a number of initiatives today of different groups trying to come together and create an opposition front. They're trying to prepare for the parliamentary elections that will technically happen in 2 years. There's a lot of energy being spent around preparing potential parliamentary candidates. About at least 2 to 3 new political parties have emerged and have been established. They're still very small, they're still very fragile, but there is real work happening on that front and in multiple ways. They're becoming more organized, and there's the usual bickering internally, who takes the lead, who doesn't take the lead, but there is a lot of energy going into that against all odds. I mean, having half the city, half the capital blown up is catastrophic for many people. Lost their lives, they lost family members, they lost friends. So, and yet they're still going. There is an attempt to continue to push on that front. The challenge that they face in Lebanon is the sense that they've been abandoned by the international community. And the abandonment here is not in terms of material support. Nobody, I mean, a lot of the groups today will say, we do not want funding from anybody. The funding has to be from the Lebanese for the Lebanese, in terms of, I'm talking political parties and actions. However, where they want support from the international community is in terms of helping to stabilize Lebanon in a region that's going up in flames. What we've seen over the past few weeks, a month and something, is what initially was a promising initiative that people thought perhaps is a French-US initiative to stabilize the situation in Lebanon, get a government in place that is able to negotiate and at least address the economic issues. As in Iran today, the big demand, it has been here for many years, but now the demand is becoming greater and greater for individuals, the government of independence, people who know what they're doing, who are experts in their own areas and can really hit the ground running and are not looking for political glory in that sense. And there are plenty of those around. I'll get back to Syria.
Yeah, can I interject here though? I hear this over and over and over. I need you, as a very thoughtful analyst, and maybe a betting woman, there are casinos in Lebanon. Where are these kids, are the new actors, is this new civil society going to make a difference, or is it just another round? We see what is commonly thought of as the Arab Spring 2, with protests in Lebanon and Iraq and Algeria and Sudan. And there is a lot of hope that there will be some kind of new momentum that again challenges, both Sam Huntington and Alvin Toffler talked about the 3 waves of democracy. And is this one of the kind of second waves we're seeing in the Arab world? But I want to know, I want a sense from you. You say they're fragile. Are they going to make a difference? And I also want, every time there is a government that's on the line, there's this plaintive appeal, oh, the international community needs to do more, whether it's providing funds or leadership direction and so forth. And as someone who's covered the Middle East since the 1973 war, I'm getting really tired of that. And I want someone, I'm looking for people to help carve out their own future, and then others can get behind them. But I think that that's true in the outside world, that we're kind of exhausted by weighing in, whether it's with aid or political leverage. So is this generation going to make a difference?
This generation can make a difference
No,
if they're given
not can. Will it?
Yes, they can. They can make a difference, and they will make a difference, but they need the space, Robin. This is a young I've seen kids on the streets for the past, since let's say 2015, when the You Stink movements. They're tenacious, they're politically mature, far more mature than their parents' generation. They know what they want and they're going after it. The demonstrations in Lebanon in particular in 2019 showed that there is a large cross-section of population, not just kids, but different generations who don't want to have anything to do with their political leadership, the political/sectarian leadership. Today, the protests happened within communities and not simply across communities. So I think there is today, the sense that people have is that there is a move on the street, and then that is horizontal, that crosses different groups, identities, everything you want. And then there's the vertical cleavages by a political class that is still reactionary, that holds the levers of power, and that has brought the country to its knees politically and economically. And how much leverage will these kids have, no matter how well organized they are, if they're operating in a situation where Turkey is playing its game, the U.A.E is playing its game, but the country is open season for anybody who wants to, enter. Lebanon has become, for quite some time, there was a bit of a firewall around the country. That firewall is now disintegrating. And the maximum pressure campaign that is being applied by the US, exactly what both Dan and Vali were saying, which is to try and change the situation before the elections, to make it impossible for a Biden presidency, should that happen, to be able to backtrack on certain things. What I was trying to get at with the French initiative is right at the point when the government was about to be announced, and it looked like it was going to be a government of, I know some of the names that were being proposed for that government, independence that would have stabilized the country economically. The sanctions came out against Berri's closest associate. They could have waited a week. And now everybody is kind of retreated. There is a more hardline approach on the government formation, and a kind of wait and see game. Let's see what happens with the elections. The country will not withstand, will not be able to stand on its feet until the elections. So coming back to these kids, coming back to the people on the streets, they're not all kids. You have people from all sorts of generations. Yes, they can make a difference, but they need the breathing space. And no, I'm sorry, there is an obligation of the international community to try and stabilize, because they're involved in the situation here. They're involved in the region. Firewalling, creating a firewall around Lebanon is important, unless we want one more completely collapsed state, which has 1 million refugees. You cannot, the people on the street are not operating in a vacuum. So that's in terms of Lebanon. In terms of humanitarian aid, the country is broke. So again, yes, there is a need for humanitarian aid. What can we do? Actually, this opens the door for the kinds of serious reforms that are desperately needed and that will undermine the entire political class down the road. Part of the reason why these reforms have not happened is because we're asking these people, Hezbollah included, to commit political suicide. You're asking them to cut off the areas that they've been using for their own political gain. Fast moving to Syria, just very quickly, just to get in a few words. The Syrian situation is very different. A lot of the younger generation that was out on the street in 2011, 2012, 2013, that continue fighting, many of these are now in exile. Most of them are operating in exile. Those that remained in Syria, or those that remained in opposition-held territories in Syria, have either been targeted, or they've turned towards, to survive, they've turned towards humanitarian support. So I think the situation there is very, very different. The question there for me is, To what extent can the diaspora that is outside of the civic diaspora that is outside of Syria play a role in Syria? They can play a role, but again, there needs to be some sort of political stability. You're talking about an opposition that doesn't have guns, operating in a theater where everybody has a gun under the table.
Thank you very much. I think the question for me has always been, in looking at this decade of conflict within Syria, even though all Syrians will like to say, yes, yes, I'm a Syrian, but they all define what it is to be a Syrian quite differently. And I wonder whether Bashar Assad is going to face even greater challenges post-conflict than he did during the war, as people hold him to account, and they find it very difficult to rebuild Syria even to where it was in a sorry state before the uprising. I have individual questions for Dan and Vali from the audience, but I want to ask each one of you to address one broad question. Having covered the Middle East for so long, I've been struck by the fact there is usually some kind of ideology, be it Nasserism or in Egypt, or the Baathism of Syria and Iraq, the Islamism of ISIS and the various Islamist political factions. There's traditionally been something out there that has defined what is the most energetic or dynamic political force in the region. It's not to say they're good, but they were the kind of popular idea. And one thing that's striking is that you don't find either an identifiable leader or an identifiable ideology in the region. Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, has tried to provide that using the resources of his state and the powers invested largely in his father to create, a vision of the region that is Saudi-centric. But I'm wondering, for each of you, your reflections on the state of leadership and ideas moving forward in the world's most volatile region that is also so fragile. We only have 10 minutes left maximum. Dan, you also have a question to please explain why the two-state solution is still viable, and why isn't a one-state solution a viable alternative, as Peter Beinart has argued. For Vali, we have a question. What would the US and others have to do to get Iran to significantly reduce its malign activities in the region? So I'll get each of you to answer my broad question and these two specific questions, and that will be our final round. Dan?
Sure. I used to say that the region had moved from Nasser to Nasrallah, from a leader who was kind of secular pan-Arab nationalism to a kind of pan-Islam kind of nationalism. And I think we're now in a post-Nasrallah, as you suggested in the question, a post-Nasrallah identity crisis in the region, where there are centripetal forces at work driving states in so many different directions against the backdrop or on the ruins of all of these other failed states in Libya and Yemen and Syria, potentially increasingly in Lebanon. So that kind of everybody is off on their own without a unifying principle, either Arab or Muslim. You don't even have, I think, what King Abdullah of Jordan called some years ago the Shia Crescent, because the Shia Crescent is also fragmented from where he thought he could define it. So I don't know what the answer is in terms of a region-wide ideology or idea, and it's kind of a role in search of a hero. And that leads to the question, are there any heroes in the Middle East? And the answer is no. It's a region that's devoid of leadership, of the kind of thoughtful, forward-looking leadership that can free its own people from whatever morass they're in and see beyond their own borders. It just doesn't exist. On the specific question, I would suggest thinking in terms of a Venn diagram, in which one circle you have the idea of Israel as a democracy. In another circle, you have the idea of Israel as a Jewish state. Both of those ideas having been concretized in what's called a basic law, which is an Israeli constitutional law. And the third circle, the idea of what do you do with the territories occupied since 1967? And if you draw that Venn diagram properly, nothing works except a two-state solution. If you have Israel as a democracy and holding on to all the territories, it does become one state, but there's no support within Israel or the Palestinian community for a one-state outcome. You've got a very small minority. If you have the Jewish state territory connection, you end up with a situation in which Palestinians would not be given equal rights, which means you don't have a democracy. So you're left with a two-state solution. And I say this because every effort to try to find an alternative to the two-state solution has failed. There is no alternative to giving Palestinians an independent state of whatever size and whatever governance capabilities sitting alongside Israel and developing a bilateral relationship with a neighbor.
Great. We are very close to running out of time. We're going to run over a couple of minutes, so I need our final comments to be as brief as possible. But one thing, Dan, that really strikes me about your comment about the concentric circles, the Middle East, sadly, is a microcosm of the broader world when it comes to the fact that we don't have that kind of leadership cohesion. Even the Western alliance seems to be fraying, or it's not unraveling, but it's certainly fraying, whether it's challenges to NATO, the Brexit move within the European Union, Trump's criticism of America's traditionally closest allies. And we don't have the kind of democracy promotion, that sense that that's the one idea that all humanity wants. Even if they do, we don't have the momentum, the direction, the leadership on that issue. So the problems of the Middle East may reflect something that is much bigger. So Vali, you're up next to answer the broad question and the specific, as briefly as possible.
Sure. On the broad question, I make two sort of quick observations. One is that there's a very interesting generational change among particularly the leadership of the Persian Gulf monarchies. MBS and MBZ represent a very different approach to priorities for their nations. They're not beholden to the old pan-Arab, pan-Islamic kinds of visions. They want a sort of a modernization vision. I think the parallel, historical parallel to them is the Shah in Iran, a sort of a westernizing, modernizing force. Now, whether that sticks, whether that becomes the mantra, it would be interesting to watch. And then more broadly in the region, I think the politics of the region are now much more understandable to the outside. You know, Islam or Arabism, Iranian nationalism, they're all in the background, the same way as they are in any other part of the world. But this is really a realpolitik region engaged in a great power rivalry. These are kinds of conflicts we are familiar with, and we shouldn't hide behind the fact that, oh, this is Shia, Sunni, Islamic ideology, and we don't understand this, and this region's rules are different from the rest of the world. It actually will help us solve its problems more if we don't try to shrug responsibility by saying we don't understand it. We understand it. This looks like Europe before World War I, or it looks like the scramble for Africa. This is a very familiar scene. On the issue of Iran's proxy activity, I mean, we have to start by asking, why is Iran doing this? You know, the prevalent answer outside is that it has imperial ambitions, that but that doesn't necessarily track with the way in which at least it's seen within Iran itself. There are multidimensional, I'm sure there is some degree of that, but a lot of this has to do with Iran's security doctrines within the region. So, you know, to Iran, the proxies are a weapon system. They are an answer to Israel's superior air force. Hezbollah is basically the way in which the Soviets wanted to put missiles in Cuba. It's a way of Iranians believe if it wasn't for Hezbollah's threat to Israel, Israel would be flying over Iran every week. And there would be no reaction. Iran's conventional military is nothing to write home about. So it has to be part of a general negotiation of reducing security tensions in the region. It has to be part of an arms control agreement between Iran and its neighbors. The nuclear deal was not going to solve the regional issues, but I think it was a very good first step that if it had stuck, it had moved forward, it would have opened the door to having a broader conversation in the region. It's not going to be easy, but right now, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran and U.A.E. are not really even talking to each other, right? And we're right now talking about a war with Iran within 6 months. That's not a kind of an environment in which Iran would actually give this up. And then when you sit at the table and say, okay, they agree to come and talk about Hezbollah, about the Houthis, about Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, what is it that they're going to get for doing that? Are we just asking for surrender, or is this a negotiation in which there's a give and take? And I think that's a very hard thing. That really goes to Iran's threat perceptions in the region, and that has to be solved incrementally.
Last but never least, Maha, could you weigh in on our broad question?
Just very briefly, I think we're in the region, like actually much across the world, we're in a kind of a post-ideological situation. I mean, I look at the younger generation across the region, and yes, it's not Pan-Arabism nor Islamism that's really attracting them, despite what we see about ISIS and other more fundamentalist movements. It's more about rights. It's more about sets of principles. It's more about what will get us the kinds of countries we want. If you look at all the Arab Springs demonstrations from Sudan to Tunis to Yemen to Lebanon to everywhere you looked, what people were demanding was the freedoms, fundamental freedoms, social justice, the right to have a say in the way they're governed. And I think this kind of broad, if you want, sets of principles are still very much pervasive today. The issue is how do you get them and how do you get there? And this is, I think, where we get into the weeds. The breakdown of the kind of silos, the identity politics that we saw. I'll take Iraq for one example. The big challenges today are within the Shia community. It's different groups of Shia parties that are against each other. The same in Lebanon, and I mean the same across the region. So it's no longer about silos or about religious or ethnic identities. It's become, I think, much broader in that sense. Just finally, in terms of leadership and vision, I agree there isn't a Gamal Abdel Nasser, nor is there a Gandhi in this region today, someone who can command that kind of support from a broad spectrum. I think there are, but I don't know that there is a demand for something like this anymore, or that it's even possible. We're operating in a very different world today. We're operating in a much more fragmented, multipolar, whatever setup. So it's a very, very different situation. There are national leaderships that you can see in different places, but not in the way that we had the Gamal Abdel Nasser. I'll stop here. I know we've run out of time.
Yeah, we are. Let me just make one comment on that. I think that one of the most striking things about the issues in the Middle East is we also see them writ large in the 21st century, that because of technology and education, access to information and awareness, that everyone around the world is now aware of their rights. And they want more, whether it's part of the political pie or the economy, a sense of participation in the social structure. The problem is that there is very little sense of the responsibility that goes along with rights and the kind of compromises that people have to make. They don't want to give up what they think is their piece of the pie to share with others. Everyone wants a little bit bigger piece of it, be it economic, political, or whatever, to ensure that the next guy isn't going to beat them, given the tensions in the past. So this is a 2-minute warning. Dan asked for one last question. If you can do it in 30 seconds, it's yours, and then we have to say goodbye.
I want to leave you with 2 thoughts. Number one, what would happen if Arab leaders met in the summit, reaffirmed the Arab Peace Initiative to replace the Trump Initiative, and affirmed support for the Arab Human Development Reports to fill in deficits of freedom, education, and women's empowerment? Leadership, changes, big ideas. Okay.
That's wonderful. What a great way to end on a hopeful note and an idea. I want to really thank our speakers, Dan Kurtzer, Vali Nasser, Maha Yaya, Marissa for helping to organize this event. It's been great. I want to thank the Wilson Center and the U.S. Institute of Peace. Thank you all. This will be available on video if you didn't get to see it all, and we're also going to publish a transcript. Well done, and thanks again.
Thank
So
you.
long.
Thank you.